The scene opens in darkness, only the flicker of a kerosene lamp. Snow presses against the farmhouse windows in Richford, New York. Inside, silence reigns, broken only by the whisper of a child's voice. On his knees beside a narrow bed, a boy no older than 10 clasps his hands tightly. The room is plain, bare walls, a thin quilt, a Bible resting on a shelf. His lips move with the intensity of someone much older, repeating words he has heard so many times that they have become carved into him. "Give us this day our daily bread." The voice is John D. Rockefeller, not yet a titan of oil, not yet the richest man in America, only a boy, trembling, searching for certainty in a world that feels unstable, with a father absent more often than present, and a mother who insists that faith must be the compass that will never fail. From the very beginning, religion was not a quiet decoration in John's household. It was the iron spine of his upbringing, pressed into him by Eliza, a mother whose gaze could steady a storm. The Rockefellers were not wealthy. They had no ornate church pews or gilded altars waiting for them. Their faith was the rugged, unsentimental faith of rural Baptists in the 1840s. Cold winter mornings trudging down frozen paths to a modest wooden meeting house. Hymns sung not by trained choirs, but by weary farmers and their families. Sermons that thundered more about duty than joy. For Eliza, and therefore for John, religion was less about comfort and more about discipline. It was a code, a structure, a demand. And within that demand, the young boy learned how to measure himself, not in coins, not yet, but in obedience, in restraint, in the invisible tally of righteousness. Every Sunday, the family moved as if on rails. While William, the father, might be gone on one of his mysterious journeys peddling miracle potions, Eliza gathered her children, buttoned their coats, and walked them to church. She would grip John's small hand tightly, as if pulling him across the threshold of a world better than the one his father represented. Inside the chapel, the smell of wood smoke clung to the rafters. Ministers raised voices that shook the air with warnings of sin and visions of heaven. John sat stiffly, absorbing every word. When the preacher spoke of the wide road to ruin and the narrow path to salvation, the boy's dark eyes locked on the pulpit, as though already weighing which path he would choose, already rehearsing the discipline required to stay upon it. The contrast at home was sharp. His father, William, a man of charm and deception, embodied the world the sermons warned against. He was a trickster, a gambler, a seller of false cures. At times he swaggered through the door with pockets full of coins, dropping them noisily on the table as if daring anyone to question how they were earned. At other times, he disappeared for weeks, leaving Eliza to shoulder the burden of respectability, of stability, of faith. To young John, this duality was more than confusing. It was formative. He saw in his father the embodiment of temptation, of quick gain, of power without morality. And he saw in his mother the opposite, a woman who knelt to pray before every meal, who read scripture by candlelight, who demanded thrift, sobriety, and devotion. From these two poles, John's personality began to crystallize, a strange alloy of ruthless practicality tempered by religious self-control. In the quiet of his room, John began to practice the rituals of faith on his own. He kept a small notebook where he copied verses that struck him, rehearsing them until they became part of his memory.
He recited them before sleep, testing his ability to hold a steady rhythm, just as he would later test his ability to balance accounts and count coins without error. Prayer for him was less about ecstasy and more about training. He treated it like a ledger of the soul, a daily balancing of debts and credits with the Almighty. And in that discipline, he found not only spiritual reassurance, but also the first taste of control over a life that otherwise felt precarious. The hymns left deep impressions. John's voice was thin but clear when he joined the congregation in singing Rock of Ages or Amazing Grace. These songs carried a power that exceeded their melodies. They carried the weight of endurance, of survival. They stitched together the scattered farms of upstate New York, binding families like the Rockefellers to a shared narrative of struggle and redemption. For a boy who would one day calculate the flow of oil across a continent, these hymns were the first music of unity, the sense that individuals could merge into a force greater than themselves when they sang with one voice. Later, as Standard Oil rose to dominate the economy, some would see tyranny in that unity. But to John, the seeds of that vision were planted in church pews when he learned the resonance of collective purpose.
His mother's lessons went beyond Sundays. Eliza wove faith into every corner of daily life. She insisted that every penny had a moral weight, that waste was not merely foolish but sinful. When John received small coins for chores, she urged him to tithe a portion, to give back to the church as a sign that all blessings ultimately flowed from God. The boy internalized this lesson with unusual seriousness. To him, money became not a toy, not a fleeting indulgence, but a sacred trust. Even in his earliest ledgers, those neat little books he kept as a teenager, one can see the echo of this religious worldview. Every dollar carefully noted, every expense justified, every sum squared with exacting clarity. Money, like faith, demanded accountability. There were moments of struggle, too. The sermons often thundered with the fear of hellfire, the punishment awaiting sinners. For a child with a sensitive conscience, this was heavy. John wrestled in silence, wondering if he had prayed enough, if he had given enough, if some hidden fault might condemn him. This inner tension never fully left him. Even decades later, when he was one of the most powerful men alive, he would confess that he often worried about his soul, about whether he had lived up to the demands of faith. This gnawing unease became part of his drive, an endless pursuit not only of wealth, but of moral justification for that wealth. His empire would not simply be a monument to money. It would, in his eyes, be proof that he had managed the talents God had entrusted him. As John grew into adolescence, faith became less a burden and more a harness for ambition. He joined the church formally as a teenager, undergoing baptism, standing before the congregation as a young man declaring his allegiance to God. This was not a casual gesture. In Baptist communities, church membership was both a spiritual milestone and a social contract. It marked him as serious, reliable, trustworthy, the qualities that would later make him indispensable to employers and partners. When others his age drifted between idleness and mischief, John carried himself with the composure of someone who believed he was being watched, not only by neighbors, but by God himself. The tension between his parents remained an unspoken drama in this faith journey. William mocked religious strictness, scoffing at Eliza's seriousness, but in mocking, he inadvertently strengthened John's resolve.
The boy could see, with stark clarity, the difference between a life guided by principle and one blown by whim. Where his father's charisma won short-term gains, his mother's discipline offered endurance. John chose endurance. It was the Baptist creed made flesh: hard work, frugality, perseverance. He began to imagine his own future through this lens, not merely as a man who might succeed, but as a man who must succeed to prove his mother's faith correct, to justify the sacrifices she made, to demonstrate that obedience and discipline could triumph over chaos and deceit. Church life also gave John his first taste of community responsibility. He saw deacons counting offerings, ministers balancing the meager church budget, families pooling resources to repair a leaking roof or support a sick neighbor. These were small economies, but they mirrored the larger one he would one day command. He studied how trust was built and maintained, how reputations were guarded, how one careless act could destroy years of credibility. He learned that a man's word was his bond, not only in the eyes of men, but in the eyes of God. And so when he later crafted deals that reshaped entire industries, he carried with him the same solemnity, the same conviction that trust and discipline were sacred currencies. Evenings often ended with family devotions. Eliza gathered the children, opened the Bible, and read aloud. John listened, sometimes weary, sometimes entranced. The cadences of Scripture, its parables of stewardship, its stern warnings, its promises of reward for the faithful, echoed in his mind. Stories of Joseph in Egypt managing grain during famine must have struck him with particular force. Here was a biblical hero who prospered not through battle or conquest, but through management, calculation, and foresight. In Joseph's rise, John may have glimpsed the archetype of what he could become: a steward of resources, chosen by providence to wield authority for the sake of order and survival.
There were, of course, doubts that flickered at the edges. John was not blind to the hypocrisy of some church members, nor immune to the temptations of ambition. But rather than discarding faith, he used it as a framework to discipline his ambition. If others sinned by wasting or by boasting, he would be the opposite. He would save, he would remain silent, he would let results speak. Religion did not erase his hunger for success. It channeled it into forms that appeared respectable, even virtuous. This fusion became his lifelong hallmark, the relentless capitalist cloaked in the garments of a devout Baptist, the industrial general who spoke softly of God while reshaping economies with ruthless precision. In the world of 19th century America, religion was also a ladder. Church networks opened doors to employers, mentors, and patrons. John's faith marked him as trustworthy, and employers took note. His reputation for honesty was not only a personal trait, it was an asset cultivated within the church community, where every action reflected on one's spiritual standing. To hire John was to hire someone who feared both earthly and divine judgment if he erred. This fear, paradoxically, made him fearless in business. He could take risks, knowing he would temper them with prudence, knowing he would not betray trust. Others gambled wildly, but John calculated piously. As the boy became a young man, the rhythm of faith never left him. He tithed faithfully, even when he earned only a few dollars a week. He attended prayer meetings, sometimes leading them with a calm seriousness that impressed elders. He carried himself with an almost eerie composure for his age, as if the weight of eternal judgment already rested on his shoulders. Friends sometimes found him aloof, too reserved, too self-contained. But beneath that reserve was the furnace of conviction,
lit by the steady hand of his mother, stoked by the solemn hymns of the Baptist chapel, and hardened by the contrast with a father who seemed the very embodiment of the world's temptations. This is the paradox that defined Rockefeller, a man who would one day accumulate more wealth than any other, yet who always framed his empire in the language of stewardship, of responsibility, of divine trust. To outsiders, it seemed like hypocrisy. To him, it was consistency. He had been raised to believe that every coin carried a moral weight, that waste was sin, that discipline was holy. His faith was not a cloak he put on in public, it was the bone and marrow of his identity, the unseen architecture that shaped every choice. Even in moments when he bent rules or crushed competitors, he convinced himself that he was serving a larger order, a divine plan that demanded efficiency, consolidation, and mastery. The boy kneeling in that cold farmhouse room would one day kneel in far grander chambers, but the posture remained the same. Prayer, tithing, discipline, these became the daily liturgies of his empire. When critics accused him of greed, he pointed to his charities, his devotions, his quiet Baptist faith. Whether one sees in that a mask or a genuine conviction, the roots are undeniable. They stretch back to Richford, to Cleveland, to every small chapel where young John's voice rose in hymns, where his hands clutched coins destined for the collection plate, where his mother's eyes watched to be sure he understood that wealth without faith was ruin, and faith without discipline was nothing at all. And so the story of Rockefeller's faith is not a minor footnote, it is the skeleton of the man. Without it, his ambition might have been reckless, his empire short-lived, his reputation irreparably stained. With it, he built not only an industrial colossus, but also a narrative of moral purpose that endured. He cast himself as a steward, a servant of divine order, a man whose very wealth was proof of God's favor. And it all began in the fragile stillness of childhood nights, with the flame of a kerosene lamp and the whispered prayers of a boy determined never to stray from the narrow path, no matter how wide and tempting the world beyond his window might become.